I'm Carlos Ivan Lopez. I'm the Vice President of the Venezuelan American Association of the US. I would like to welcome all of you to today's conversation with Jose Ignacio Hernandez and Michael McCarty. Given the recent changes we are seeing in the direction of Venezuelan politics and the recent interaction of political forces, we thought it would be a good idea to discuss what's going on. And that's why the topic of today's conversation is change coming to Venezuela or more of the same. I would like to give thanks to Mr. Hernandez and Mr. McCarthy for taking their time to be with us and discuss this topic and express their point of view, and to our Vice President, Ambassador Michael Scott, who will guide the discussion as a moderator. The Venezuelan American Association has been promoting exchange between Venezuela and the US for over 85 years. During this unprecedented crisis, VAUS has been diligent in fostering discussion to spark action. We thank you all for accompanying us on our quest for knowledge and for a better future for Venezuela. And now I would like to introduce you our panelists today. Jose Ignacio Hernandez is a fellow of the Growth Lab at the Harvard Kennedy School and a law professor at the Catholic University of Andrés Bello, an invited professor at several universities in Latin America, Spain, and Asia. He's an independent consultant on the rule of law, state capability, and development. Between 2019 and 2020, he acted as Special Attorney General under the government of Venezuela under the interim President Juan Guaido. Michael McCarty is a strategic advisor with 2 decades of experience as a political analyst of international affairs, US foreign policy, and Latin America. He's a specialist in the Venezuela, the Andean region, and Argentina. In 2016, he founded Caracas Wire, LLC, an integrated strategic research advisory firm that delivered clients customized analysis of the economic and political situations shaping Venezuela's future scenarios. He's also an adjunct professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs of George Washington University and research fellow at the Center for Latino and Latin American Studies at American University. Finally, I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Michael Scott. Michael was a US ambassador to Venezuela from 1990 to 1993. Besides Caracas, his other foreign service postings were Buenos Aires, Saigon, Santo Domingo, Naples, Rome, San Jose, Bogota, and Washington, D.C. Since his retirement from the State Department, Ambassador Scott has pursued a second career in anti-corruption, counter-money laundering, and risk management services. He's a principal of the National US-Colombia Consortium, it's called ANCERTA. And now I turn the program over to him to begin this conversation. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Let me tell everybody that if you want to ask a question at any time during or after the presentations, you just press the chat button, write out your question, and I will read it out for our panelists. Okay, let's start with the basic question. Venezuela today is I would call it a Chavez, Maduro, Castro-created catastrophe. The question is, how bad is it, and will there be any change anytime soon? Let's start with Jose Ignacio.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Thank you to the Venezuelan American Association of the United States, Ambassador Michael Scott, Carlos Ivan Lopez, my dear friend Michael McCarty. I'm going to share with you a short presentation that tries to summarize where Venezuela goes from here. But to try to answer to this concept, to this question, sorry, we first need to understand what is here. And it is very important to have the diagnostic about what are the problems that should be solved in Venezuela, because there is a trend that tries to simplify the Venezuelan crisis as a problem of an authoritarian regime. Unfortunately, in my opinion, that's not the main problem that should be solved in Venezuela. So what is here when we talk about Venezuela? First, we're talking about an unparalleled GDP collapse. It's greater than the collapse of the Great Depression. It's greater than the collapse of the Spanish Civil War. If we want to compare the Venezuelan GDP collapse, we should analyze what happened, for instance, in Germany during the Second World War. This is a graphic that analyzed the GDP collapse from the Harvard Growth Lab. And the estimation is that since 1999 up to today, the GDP collapse could be estimated in 80%. But also, Venezuela is facing a complex humanitarian emergency that has triggered the second biggest migration crisis in the world and the first crisis in the region. Those are the numbers of the Venezuelan refugee and migrant crisis updated up September 2021. We are talking about 5.7 million Venezuelan people abroad and 4.6 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees just in Latin America. We are talking also about hyperinflation and a de facto dollarization that have aggravated poverty. This week, the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello presented the recent NCOVI survey that analyzed, among other variables, poverty in Venezuela. And according to this survey, Venezuelan total poverty can be estimated in 94.5%, while the Venezuelan extreme poverty can be calculated in 66.6. We are talking also about a non-competitive authoritarianism that has the lowest rule of law rank in the world, according to the Rule of Law Index. But in addition, we are also talking about a fragile state with weak institutions that have been co-opted by organized crime. This is a graphic that I love to explain in my talks about Venezuela. It's the measure of the Venezuelan fragility according to the Fragile State Index. As you can see here, between 2006 and 2013, the capacity of the Venezuela state increased. It was a consequence of the predatory policies adopted by Hugo Chavez and the oil boom. But starting in 2013, the state capacity of Venezuela has been collapsing, or in other words, the fragility of the Venezuelan state is increasing. And today, Venezuela should be considered a fragile state. This is why, in my opinion, the only problem that should be fixed in Venezuela is not only a democratic transition. We are dealing with a complex transition that has to do, of course, with a democratic transition, but also with an economic transition and a transition from the fragile and criminal state to a capable state under the rule of law. And the question is, how do we get here? In the Harvard Growth Lab, we have developed a narrative that explains how Venezuelan collapsed. Everything started back in 1999 when Venezuelan people elected an authoritarian populist leader, Hugo Chavez, that started a slow motion process of constitutional democracy decimation. After that, in 2003, Hugo Chavez implemented several policies that destroy the market mechanism, and after that, destroy the oil industry. And it should bear in mind that approximately 97% of the foreign currency from export derive from the oil industry. But in addition, and despite the gigantic oil boom that started in 2006, the biggest oil boom in the Venezuelan history, Chavez and Maduro promoted an over indebtedness. The Venezuelan public debt, the external Venezuelan public debt, could be estimated in 140 billion of dollars. The result of all those predatory policies was the collapse of the state and the complex humanitarian emergency. And to be honest, Venezuelans have tried different transition strategy to advance in a democratic path to promote an economic recovery and to rebuild the state capability. Venezuela has trying an electoral way. In 2015, the Democratic opposition won the supermajority of the National Assembly. However, due to the decimation of the rule of law, the National Assembly was not able to exert its constitutional powers. In 2016, the Venezuelan opposition tried a presidential recall referendum that was suspended by the electoral power, by criminal courts, and in the end by Maduro's regime. We have tried also, particularly since 2017, mass protests that were brutally repressed by Maduro's regime in gross human rights violations that are, under preliminary investigations at the International Criminal Court. Also, the Venezuelan has promoted transitional justice. I worked in the first transitional justice law in Venezuela back in 2016, offering co-government mechanisms to the Chavistas and Maduro's members of those elites that were interested in work together in rebuild the rule of law. However, the offer of a transitional justice has not resulted in incentive to move into a negotiated solution. Then in 2019, the Venezuelans tried an absolute innovative way, the interim government of President Juan Guaido, with international support, with international sanctions. And despite all this effort, well, Maduro is still here. And it is naturally that with all these efforts and the permanence of Maduro's authoritarian regime, Venezuelans are start thinking, well, how can we get out of here? Where do we fail? And I am not going to answer all these questions. On the contrary, I hope that during the discussions that we're going to have, we are going to be able to uh, find some of those questions. But here I present to you what are the possible solutions of this crisis. In my opinion, this duality of government, the de facto government of Maduro, the interim and legitimate government of Deputy Juan Guaido, is coming to an end. Both parties, Maduro and the opposition, has incentive to sit down and work on a negotiated solution. This is why, in my opinion, despite all the defect, despite all the negative conditions, the Mexico talks could resulted in a negotiated solution. But what kind of solutions? Because I am a Star Wars fan, I love to explain those solutions for Venezuela using the titles of Star Wars movies. The first scenario is the revenge of the thieves. Maduro continues his kleptocratic regime, and Venezuela will become the Somalia of Latin America. This is a failed and rogue state nation. This is something that is not present in all the analysis regarding Venezuela, but in my opinion, the binding constraint in Venezuela to promote an economic recovery is the absence of a capable state, the fragility of the Venezuelan state, and the ongoing criminal organizations that have co-opted the weak institutions of the state. So that's the first solution. The collapse continues. Maduro will become an elite, a criminal organizations with some groups controlling gold, other groups controlling oil, other groups controlling narcotics, and Venezuela will become a failed and rogue nation. The other solution, the empire strike backs, the return to the competitive authoritarianism. Maduro enter into some kind of stabilization agreement with the opposition, work together in building the state capability, but with no democratic transition. And in that case, Venezuelan people will need to wait until presidential election in 2024 to look what is happening. Finally, a new hope, a transition towards democracy, and there is a window there that we should consider the presidential recall referendum in 2022. But this is a very interesting topic that I prefer to talk to you in the Q&A section. Thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, Michael, let's ask the same question. Where are we now, and where are we headed?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ambassador Skoll, and thank you to the boss for having me back here for my second talk with this important association for bringing together Venezuelans and Americans. I'm going to structure my talk a little bit differently than Jose Ignacio, trying to offer a couple of snapshots about what's going on in the energy sector and the economy, on the one hand, and then a snapshot regarding the situation of, let's call it, leadership and strategy. And then I hope that based on an analysis of those areas, we'll be able to develop some conclusions about change of what order. In other words, what kinds of changes are we seeing currently, and where could things, where might things be heading as we look into the future a little bit. So I'm going to start with the snapshot of the energy sector. And I'm going to make a couple of notes about the statistics regarding oil production and exports. But really, the key thing to know there is that we have an oil price rally that is boosting Maduro. And if you look back 12 months from now, you will notice that oil prices were for Brent crude 80% lower than they are today. And this is a major transformation for an oil exporting country like Venezuela, even though it is continuing to experience a total collapse of the oil production capacity compared to historical levels. And the 2021 production numbers are likely to be higher than the 2020 production numbers. Not significant changes there on the year by year, but if you look back 12 months from now, when oil production hit totally historic lows of around 400,000 barrels per day on a monthly average, and you see that things are in a much better place from the perspective of Maduro, with production being above 600,000 for 4 months straight. And so that is a significant change. And likewise, exports have recovered to some extent as well, even though they're at historic lows in the big picture. And in terms of the price for the Venezuelan oil basket, the 2020 oil price for the Venezuelan basket was $28. It's looking like the 2021 oil price basket for Venezuela is going to be $49. Okay, that's a $20 difference on a year-to-year basis. And for the Maduro team, this is a major transformation. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit later about the extent to which Maduro deserves any credit for any of the increased benefits they're receiving from this very small scale recovery that's taking place. Then looking further into the energy sector, we need to recognize that just a year ago, Venezuela was experiencing an extreme fuel shortage with regards to both diesel and gasoline. And I want to note that this past August, a month ago, just a little over a month ago, I should say, the national refining capacity hit record highs in the last 6 quarters. So in terms of the ability to get fuel onto the streets, it certainly is not where we'd like it to be, certainly very far from where things were years ago in the country. But in terms of the scale of change on a month-to-month, on a quarter-to-quarter basis, it's a lot different out there on the streets in that sense. And then I think the third part of the energy sector that we should talk a little bit about is the electricity grid, the power situation, where you still have major problems with regards to rolling blackouts throughout the countryside, mostly in the interior, but also in the major urban centers. And so if you had to do an analysis sort of in review, you know, they've made some improvements in the first 2 parts, but in the third area of the power grid, you have really big problems. And now moving over to the economy, not just the energy sector itself, I think it's fair to say that Maduro set a new path for the management of the economy. And how would we describe that, the pattern, right? The incipient pattern that they're moving along in terms of this new path? Well, I think the best way to describe it is twisted liberalization. And I'll tell you why I think it's first twisted. The reason that we have chosen this term at Caracas Wire is that the means by which Maduro has made some of these changes have to do with unconstitutional mechanisms, right? The use of the unconstitutional National Constituent Assembly and other laws passed through those bodies. At the same time, I think concrete changes have taken place dating back to really 2016, 2017. We have a bit of a debate there about when to sort of note the origins of this new path. I think it's fair to say that in 16 and 17, when Maduro noticed that the fiscal crisis he was facing meant he could no longer finance imports for foodstuffs and pass that responsibility to the private sector, that was an important moment. Then came the flexibilization and the liberalization of currency controls. And then we've had a transition from what I would call de facto dollarization to ad hoc dollarization, okay? And then there's the question of why would we call this liberalization? I'd only say that it's liberalization because it's non-state centric or less non-state centric than before. In other words, I'm not arguing that we're talking about a liberal revolution within Chavismo in terms of an embracement of free markets. I just think that there's a different pragmatic group that has gained ascendance, so to speak, over in terms of its influence over Maduro and the decision-making process. Now, there's a second stage to that process of the new path of twisted liberalization. And that second stage brings us back to where I started in the oil sector. And that second stage was marked by the changing of the guard at PDVSA when General Quevedo was finally sacked from his position at PDVSA, and a new person, Tareq al-Assami, was placed in charge of basically the whole energy sector and large swaths of the economy as well. And this has, I think, helped consolidate some of the changes that they've been trying to accomplish in terms of a less state-centric model within the energy sector as well. And so I think that that's an important sort of context to keep in mind in terms of the last 2 years. Now, moving over to the second snapshot of leadership and strategy, I think that starting with the Maduro side of things, looking at the Kremlinology question, you still have some important divisions between the leadership at the upper echelons, but it's quite clear that this is Maduro's show. And I think it's more of Maduro's show than it's been in a long time. You have some other power brokers who are still able to be disruptive on an intermittent basis. But I think that the main power struggle between Cabello and Maduro is much different than before. And it seems to me that the power struggle, the balance of power is more tilted towards Maduro than it is towards Cabello at this point. Another important actor to keep in mind, I would say, is the role of Maduro's son, Nicolásito, who has been sort of brought out onto onto center stage to play a little bit more of an influential role, backroom dealing, and also potentially in a policy position. So just in terms of thinking about the cast of characters, you have some important developments there on the regime side. Now, with regards to the leadership and strategy for Guaido and opposition actors, I think that the Guaido situation is mostly a status quo one. And then you have in and around him a situation of ongoing fragmentation within the leadership structure of the opposition unity team. And so I think that the best thing we can hope for is to keep the house together. And we're likely to continue to have a house that internally is still quite divided, but on the facing outside, it may be still relatively united, perhaps we could say, with a lowercase u of unity rather than an uppercase U of unity in that case. And in terms of the strategy that Guaido and the opposition have been using, I think that there is an ongoing strategic convergence around a less pressure-based approach to promoting change vis-a-vis Maduro, and a perhaps more pragmatic approach in terms of calling for negotiations to take stock of the situation and see where things can go from there. We have the documented differences between some of the opposition leaders, but if you look carefully between the lines, many of them have been calling for some sort of a sit down with Maduro ever since there was a change in Washington, quite frankly. And that brings me to the third part of the changes to assess in terms of leadership and strategy. We have a new president in the United States, President Joe Biden. And the first thing to say about Biden's approach to Latin America and Venezuela is that it's still incipient. The Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America, Brian Nichols, finally received confirmation from the Senate just some weeks ago. And so I think we still have to wait and see a little bit when it comes to what the final policy will look like there. But it's quite clear that they've backed off the maximum pressure strategy of the Trump era, and that they're also not interested in even talking about the possibility of the use of military force. So you have a sort of, it looks like there's going to be a pivot in the policy, but that pivot has yet to fully be that has yet to take place, right, in terms of the full change in the policy. And in the meantime, the US has been mostly using what I would say is a containment strategy when it comes to Maduro at this moment. So just to sum up very quickly in terms of what those sort of snapshots tell us about the big question of change in Venezuela. So I think if we sort of break change down into three categories: policy, stability, and then the regime level, I think we can get some, we can develop some interesting insights. And I would say on the policy paths, yes, there have been some important developments, both in terms of the way that Maduro is trying to manage the economy and the way in which Guaido and other sectors of the opposition are engaging with Maduro. And then in terms of stability, in great part due to the redeveloped national refining capacity for diesel and gasoline, the country is less unstable than it was a year ago. And that's not even getting into the exhaustion problems associated with years and years of mass demonstrations, as Jose Ignacio noted very clearly in his presentation going back to at least 2014. And then the big question of regime level, where it's, are we talking about status quo, or are we talking about real possibilities of a non-status quo outcome looking into 2022 and 2023? I'm not too optimistic at this moment. I think that it's mostly a status quo situation. And I think that the Mexico process has slowed down recently. And I think that right now, the only area of potential consensus for getting something done is the humanitarian space. In other words, increased humanitarian assistance. So that's one issue that is important in terms of addressing the needs of the population, but it doesn't really have direct impact at the regime power struggle level. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Jose Ignacio. Let's talk about negotiations and hopes for the future and moderate optimism, especially from Jose Ignacio, about what might change in Venezuela. A truth in broadcasting, I am very pessimistic about what's going to happen in Venezuela. The Mexico talks restart a week from today. My basic question, and it's been my basic question for years now, is why would Maduro and company allow any kind of real change, any kind of election results which could challenge his position and power? We all know that he and his generals and his Cuban supporters don't want to cede power because it would lead to all kinds of things. It would lead to reprisals, extradition, loss of personal wealth, prison. My reading of what's going on in Venezuela right now is that the government is absolutely dependent on that criminal enterprise staying where it is, and that any kind of negotiations or movement, except on the periphery, are a charade. And of course, in the world we live in today, people love charades, and they're following it. Any comment, Michael, Jose Ignacio?
Do you want to go first, Jose Ignacio, or okay, great, perfect. Yeah, so I think that there are a few things to say there, Ambassador Skoll. The first is that negotiations need to be understood as a fundamentally political process. It's not about morality, it's not about goodwill, it's about leverage and power. It's about what you have to offer at that table, right? And what one is willing to give in the context of offering something, right? And I think that when you look at the situation right now, there aren't any strong incentives for Maduro to make a big concession. I think you're right about that. And that's because there are basically, things that Guaido cannot offer, right? That are just sort of no-goes in terms of the negotiating stance from his perspective. And the international actors that are involved, they are influential. Holland on the side of the opposition, and Russia on the side of Maduro. But I don't really see them as being able to, fully pressure their sides or huddle with their sides significantly to bring things together. And the Norwegians, while they're very good at mediation and bringing people together, their job here is not to really negotiate, so to speak, right? That's not really what they're up to in this particular space. And I think that negotiations are sort of cyclical in the Venezuelan conflict when you look back historically, and it really comes down to the incentives of what would force or prompt someone to make a really important move in a different direction. And as you've noted, the stakes of power are just too high at this current moment, and for Maduro, because of the criminal enterprises, because of the more than 2 decades of time and power, and so on and so forth. So 2 things I will say is that one hope when it comes to negotiations is that one of the actors will miscalculate, right? They will make a mistake, and that mistake will then sort of the actor will be held accountable to their mistake, right? So if Maduro does miscalculate, let's hope that then he's held accountable to that mistake in terms of opening things up more than he really is interested in doing. That's one thing that I think is important to keep an eye on. And then I think it's also relevant to mention that when you look at the sort of long-term impacts of these talks, which are going to go on for longer than was initially anticipated, and I think that Maduro this time around is less likely to receive renewed backing from his international allies, Russia and China principally, than in past negotiations, okay? And that has to do with the fact that the Venezuelan crisis has been deprioritized by major powers on a global level. And also right now, China and Russia don't feel as exposed by Maduro's criminal and repressive behavior, right? It's not something that is creating as big of an image problem as it did for them during the waves of mass protests, which resulted in significant state repression against those actors. So you've got a different context there.
Thank you. I will say that to be realistic regarding the Venezuelan future, I think that the first step that we need to clarify is, again, what is the nature of the problem that we are trying to solve. And in that sense, we can have a better understanding about what to expect in the Mexico negotiations. There is, as I explained, a clear trend, in my opinion, to try to present the Venezuelan case as a traditional democratic backslide, Maduro as a traditional authoritarian regime, and trying to compare the pervasive and systematic kleptocracy of Maduro with those allegations of corruption of the interim government. And according to this narrative, the Venezuelan solution should be an electoral one, because the main problem to solve is a democratic transition. And in that sense, political negotiations are the best way to promote this democratic transition. Recently, I have an academic discussion with Professor Lowenthal, because he published a report at the Wilson Center, in which basically he explained that the main problem to be solved in Venezuela is a democratic one. And I am absolutely disagree with that diagnostic. As I explained in my brief presentation, Venezuela faced a complex transition, and the binding constraint that Venezuela has is not the lack of democracy or the lack of rule of law, is the collapse of the Venezuelan state. And Maduro is not only an authoritarian regime, to be more precisely, is not only an authoritarian populist regime, it is also and mainly a criminal organization, a franchise, as I say, of criminal organizations that control the weak state. And this is why it's hard to believe that elections will solve that problem. As I used to say, even if the Venezuelans were able to organize free and fair presidential elections tomorrow, Venezuela would be a failed and criminal state. So it's hard to believe that negotiations in Mexico are going to be able to solve that complex problem at a glance, at one step. However, Mexico negotiations can help at least to deter the collapse of the Venezuelan state and help to achieve some humanitarian relief. The main problem here is about incentives. Clearly, Maduro's regime has incentive to sit down in the negotiations and change his image of a criminal dictator. And this is why Maduro's regime accepted some degree of political and economic openness. In talking about the political side of these sort of twisted liberalizations, as Michael McCarthy said, I really love that expression. I'm going to steal that, by the way. Uh, we have seen, for instance, the appointment of two independent directors at the National Electoral Council is not enough, of course, but it is an improvement. The restoration of the political right of the Mesa la Unidad Democrática party is not enough, but it is an improvement. The electoral observation of the European Union is not enough, but it is an improvement. The tiny, small reforms in the criminal justice system, absolutely insufficient, but those are an improvement. So clearly, Maduro is trying to clean his image. He doesn't want to be labeled as a criminal dictatorship with a preliminary investigation at the International Criminal Court. That's an advantage because those new spaces can be used to promote this complex transition, but there is a big risk here that at the end, Maduro used these tiny spaces to stabilize the country and to move into, as I explained, a non-competitive authoritarianism, and the opposition deciding to act just as a democratic opposition and wait until the 2024 presidential election. But if the Venezuelan collapse is not stopped, in 2024, I am not sure if there's going to be something like a government of Venezuela to be able to be contested in presidential elections. So again, and to sum up, in my opinion, we need to consider that the binding constraint in Venezuela is not the lack of constitutional democracy, the lack of rule of law, is the fragile state which weak institution has been co-opted by criminal organizations That's the narrative that Maduro and a very important stakeholders, I need to say, are trying to change and try to present the Venezuelan as a traditional democratic transition, comparing the Venezuelan case with Chile, for instance. But we need to challenge that idea because otherwise the possibility of a failure are going to be even greater.
So what I'm hearing from all three of us is that the chances for real change in Venezuela are minimal. Whenever I hear someone or read somewhere hope for change because there's a couple of mayors who are going to be elected, I always recall Andres Oppenheimer's great book, Castro's Final Hour. Now, Andres Oppenheimer remains one of the great journalists reporting on Latin America. He knows the area well. Well, he wrote this book, Castro's Final Hour, in 1992. And he was wrong then. And I think those who are clinging to some optimistic hope are unfortunately, tragically wrong today. I think Venezuela has been a very effective student of Cuba, and has repeated many of the changes, both in government, in process, in attitude, that Cuba taught. The difference is that the Venezuelans had a lot more money to accelerate the process, which they did. We talk about international support. I don't think there's been anywhere near enough international support for the Venezuelan opposition or for Venezuelan migrants, for example. That statistic where the international assistance to Syrian migrants is per capita 12 times more than to Venezuelan migrants. And I can mention that one country which is possibly doing more on behalf of freedom and democracy in Venezuela is Colombia, with its open, welcoming, legalizing of some nearly 2 million Venezuelan refugees there now. A bit of an advertisement for the Venezuelan American Association. We just a couple of weeks ago we gave an award to President Duque for exactly what he is doing on behalf of the Venezuelan refugees. I don't see enough publicity for that. I don't see enough support really for change in Venezuela, for Venezuelan the humanitarian situation, and the opposite is what Venezuela remains getting. The Maduro regime is getting from its allies. Let me quote from Leopoldo Lopez speaking at the Oslo Freedom Forum. Quote, "The main reason why Maduro is still in power is because of the support he gets from powerful countries very active in promoting the expansion of authoritarianism around the world. China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and in our case, Cuba. They feed each other, help each other, learn from each other, and know how to suppress street protests. They share the mechanisms to control communications and social media." I think there's in effect, a worldwide conspiracy to make sure that there is no change, in fact, in Venezuela. By the way, anyone who has a question, just type it out, click the little chat button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to your questions a little later in the program. Anyway, Michael, Jose Ignacio, you have any reaction to what I've said about, again, stressing the sense of pessimism about what's going to happen?
It's just two comments. One, to go back to a great insight made by Jose Ignacio about the state collapse implications for transition. I think that what I would say is slightly different, which is that the collapse of state institutions is the binding constraint on a sustainable transition. In other words, you could have some sort of change at the top, right? But what we're all interested in is a long-term process of redemocratization. And I think that the core point there is that without fundamental reforms with regards to state institutions and higher quality inclusive governance, it's not going to be possible to say with any degree of confidence that Venezuela will stay on a democratic path. So that's just one thing I wanted to add about that very interesting point about the state collapse and its implications for the transition question. With regards to the international arena, Ambassador Skoll, I think that, you know, those of us who have been doing Latin America for a long time, we know that there's an unfortunate tendency for the region to be neglected. And unfortunately, that also follows for the Venezuelan crisis to some extent. You have, you know, this great power rivalry discussion going on about China, Russia, United States, European Union, so on and so forth. And it's clear that from Trump to Biden, there's a major repositioning of resources and assets toward East Asia. And it is possible to say that, I think it is in fact fair to say that to some extent, Venezuela has been a bit of a victim of that broader repositioning of resources and assets by the US. Now, I think that in terms of Leopoldo's excellent idea of kind of creating a new international movement on behalf of democracy, as opposed to sort of the traditional economic driven categories of capitalism versus socialism, things like that. I think that there's a great deal of resonance with the Biden administration, which strongly believes that you need to put democracy at the front and center of foreign policy. And that it may in fact be possible to create some community of democracies going forward, which would be really a revitalization of ideas that we've tried before in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I think that Venezuela has to be, you know, sort of in the front row in the context of any discussion about that issue, since it's one of the earliest cases of the internationally supported authoritarian backsliding, right? Both from Havana, from Moscow, and from Beijing as well, right? So Venezuela is a crucial case for understanding, you know, those changes in the last 2 decades. And I think that there's a good chance that Leopoldo will gain traction with his idea of trying to put together a movement of this sort. Now, you know, actions matter more than words, and we still know that much of international relations is driven by sort of realistic or realist calculations. And so I think we also need to be cautious about, you know, getting our hopes up about how much of a difference such a community of democracies would be as an international sort of power block of sorts. So I think it's a great idea that should be pursued, and I think the Biden administration will be all ears to that. But then putting together sort of the toolbox for solving some of these problems, you know, I think that's still very much a work in progress. Over.
Thank you. Well, I would love to address briefly three points, answering 2 of the questions that we have here. First, I also want to praise this award to President Ivan Duque, because he has been one of the leaders that has been explaining with objectivity the real nature of the Venezuelan problem, the criminality of the Venezuelan crisis. And again, in my opinion, this is a battle, the battle of the narrative that the Venezuelan, we cannot lose. Because if we lose that battle, that's going to be disastrous for Venezuela, because any strategy are going to try to fix problems that are not the relevant one. Now, to just comment briefly on the questions, there is a question about the recent allegation of corruption surrounding the interim government. Yes, there are allegations of corruptions, particularly in monomeros, that has been investigated by the National Assembly, by the way, and are currently under investigation by the government of Colombia and should be investigated, period. But we should bear in mind also that some of those allegations of corruptions are baseless. I have heard crazy denounce about corruption on Citgo, for instance, and everyone that have a clear understanding of the current situation in Citgo that is under supervision of the Treasury Department, under supervision of the Department of Justice, will clearly understand that it's not possible to move a penny from Citgo without fulfilling with very rigid controls. And there is again this idea of equate the corruption of the interim government with the corruption of Maduro. This is a distortion of reality. The kleptocracy of Maduro doesn't have comparison, not even with the corruption allegation within the interim government, but with any case of corruption in the region. I used to tell this example. The Odebrecht scandal in Latin America was about $700 million, something like that. In one case, Andrade in the United States, Andrade confessed to receive bribe for $1 billion in one just case, in only one case. So please don't try to compare those allegations of corruption with the kleptocracy of Nicolas Maduro, because this is a distortion of reality. And then a very important question about the protection of Venezuelan assets in cases like the 2020 bondholders. There are litigations ongoing, and litigations will create protections, I will say, for the next 6-8 months. And after that, sanctions will prevent any seizure against Venezuelan assets here in the United States. But there is an elephant in the room. There is a theory according to which the interim government, like Cinderella, will disappear on January the 5th, 2022. And in that case, eventually, the policy of the United States regarding asset protection of Venezuela may change, and the United States government could decide to move to the policy in force in 2018 that was not to protect Venezuelan assets, to create pressure against Maduro. That's a problem also that need to be solved. But in any case, I would like to clarify that the mandate of the interim government is not going to disappear on January the 5th, 2022. Thank you.
Well, let me just underline once again Jose Ignacio's diatribe, an analysis of on corruption. Anti-corruption is part of my business, and I don't think anyone in the anti-corruption, counter money laundering business who live today has ever seen as thorough a level of corruption and criminality from a government itself than is the Venezuelan case. There is no comparison anywhere in the world, and I would tend to argue that you'd have to go back in history, I don't know what, to medieval times, of which I am not an expert at all. The levels of corruption are staggering. In New York, all you have to do is walk down 57th Street and look up at the 100-story buildings and see all of the floors that have no lights in them because the apartments are empty, because the owners of those apartments, the Venezuelan generals or others, are on the blacklist, and they can't come to visit their apartments in New York or Miami or Europe or a lot of other places. That's the great problem. The corruption is so deep, it is so well known, so easily documented around the world that it's a very basic reason why none of these people, none of the 3,000 Venezuelan generals, nothing that I can think of would incentivize themselves to move to another place, to give up what they have now. They can live pretty well in Caracas, and they can always visit a Cuban beach or two. Anyway, the corruption is staggering. There's no way around it. And we've talked about possible changes in U.S. policy, although at the moment U.S. policy on Venezuela seems to be rather bipartisan. It's a rare instance in Washington. I don't know how long that will last. I don't know how long it will last if there's a change in U.S. policy toward Iran, which is a major contributor to Venezuela policy. Or what if a Petro is elected president of Colombia? How will that change the ability of a country like Colombia to provide enormous assistance and also wise commentary about Venezuela? Let's see, do we have any more questions here?
Michael wants to say something. Mike.
Okay, Michael.
Yeah, so let me just try and address some of the questions in the chat box, which are all very important issues. So to Alejandro's question about the way in which corruption allegations could affect perceptions of the opposition, both domestically and internationally, I think the answer is yes, it does have a more negative than positive impact. Just to clarify, why would I say positive impact? The only reason I'd say positive impact is that the very fact that you can investigate corruption about the opposition is itself perhaps a signal of a degree of transparency in the way in which things are being administered. So hopefully people will be held accountable if the charges are proved, and then that way we can really make progress in terms of addressing the issue of corruption within Venezuela more broadly. It's obviously a long-standing problem in the country that grew much worse during Chavez and Maduro, but I think you're right to suggest that voters do think about those issues when they're expressing their preferences in polls and at the ballot box. And with regards to the issues of sanctions and Crystal X, I'll echo what Jose Ignacio has already said. And just add that I think that when you look out into the near future of the first quarter of 2022, I think that that's when we'll really have a little bit more clarity about whether or not there will be a partial separation of the U.S. position on the political side from the U.S. position on the economic side when it comes to the international economics.
Michael, could you explain very briefly what the Crystal X situation is?
Yeah, well, we don't have too much time, and it's obviously a complicated story. But yes, I mean, this is the attempt to, execute some bonds and get some money from a debt related to an expropriation against the mining company, Crystal X in Venezuela from some years ago. And they're using the asset of Citgo to try and gain leverage in that sense.
Okay,
I don't need to review what's in the press
no.
On those issues. So I just wanted to say that I think the big question is, will there be any divergence in terms of the U.S. posture, in terms of legitimacy of Guaido and the interim government structure? And then on the other side, the posture towards sanctions with regards to U.S. creditors and what they're trying to achieve from the situation.
Okay.
And then the last question, just very quickly from Stephen. I'll be very quick. I think that your question, Stephen, is really important because it gets at a core point regarding the limited effectiveness of sanctions. And sanctions are a tool; they're not a policy. And the Maduro regime may have seen some of the sanctions coming, and they did eventually adapt their international strategy to develop workarounds with regards to the loss of the U.S. market. And then I think it's also fair to say that some of the economic policy developments that we've seen in the country stem from the negative impacts of the sanctions in terms of the cash flow coming into the executive branch of government. And so there are unintended consequences of sanctions as well. I'd love to keep talking about this, but we don't have enough time to keep going.
No, I'm afraid we don't. And
yeah,
we promised everybody we'd end more or less on time. I want to thank both Michael and Jose Ignacio. The three of us are going to continue this conversation at one point privately, and we may have another webinar. Who knows? Let me pass this on to Carlos Ivan. Carlos Ivan, your microphone is off.
All right, thank you. I was put on mute, so okay. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for leading vows during this difficult time for Venezuela and for Venezuelans in general. We really appreciate your leadership of the institution. Jose Ignacio and Michael McCarthy, thank you for joining us today. It's always great to see you and for allowing your time to participate in this discussion. So very good insights on what's going on. In general, I mean, as a closing remarks that we have to close right now, we'd like to also thank our hardworking team for association for making this possible today. Lina Delgado, Linda Calvet, and Lori, who manage the day-to-day of the Venezuelan American Association of the U.S. As a closing remark, we have plans for more exciting programs, and we'll keep everyone posted about them. If you are not already a member of the VAUS and are interested in joining, please reach out to our team via the invitation. I mean, we're always looking for new thoughts, new ideas, and new members. Thank you all for participating. We look forward to meeting you again very soon. Thank you.